Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we are going to talk about nerfs that I would revert. I have been through all the patch notes that I can find, at least, because I know that there was ones before this. But the earliest ones I can find is patch 0.92. So we're going to go from there and look at them. But I do know there was ones before this, because the deny nerf or whatever isn't on there. Not that I would revert deny back to 3 mana. But I know that there was ones before this, but it's not there. So we're going to start with patch 0.92, and then we're going to go through basically all the patches that had card changes and see, okay, you know, what changes would I revert? What would be a good thing to revert? And I'm not going to actually suggest reverting all the cards we're going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about some interesting cases. I think I've got a list of about, say, 10 to 12 cards that I think are interesting cases that could be reverted to either their original form or a similar form to that at some point. So with that said, let's dive in and see if you agree or not with what I have to say about these cards. And let's start at the very start with the first balance change of the first patch we are looking at, 0.92, and that is Hecarim. Because Hecarim, once upon a time, if you weren't aware, dominated this game for some time. And then they nerfed him very heavily because of that. You know, he lost one health stat, and he also, his Spectral Riders went from 3 attack to 2 attack. So, you know, a pretty significant nerf, I would say, on the whole. And Hecarim has never been the same since. He's never really seen that much play since. And I do think that this is something that could be reverted back. I think that at this moment in time, we would be perfectly fine with having a 6-drop champion that is pretty strong. And I don't think Hecarim would even be, you know, really strong. I don't think he'd be, you know, breaking the game like he did once upon a time. And I'm doing this under the context of, you know, they changed Karma and Will of Ionia back to their original forms not that long ago. And I was really worried that, oh no, is this going to break the game? Is it going to be like old times? And no, it didn't. It didn't do anything of the sort. It wasn't even close to breaking the game like it did back in the day. So I don't see why Hecarim couldn't be his old form. I really don't think I think he'd be about an average champion in his old form, if I'm being honest. So I honestly think it would be perfectly fine, and I'd be quite happy to just have Hecarim in his old form, and I think it would. There's no doubt in my mind that it would be fine. I think we have more than enough options now to, you know, deal with like these big threats, right? And they need to be powerful to be worth it. And I think Hecarim just isn't powerful enough, unfortunately. And this would be one way of getting it back. Moving on to patch 0.94, we find Bannerman, a really interesting case. And here's my case for Bannerman. 1, I like allegiance cards that are strong. 2, I don't think, you know, it's basically like Poppy's effect, but, you know, probably not quite as good. Because you need to hit allegiance. So, you know, you have to build your deck in a very certain way. So that's fine. My only thing against this would, of course, be Poppy herself. That right now, existing in this old form, and for those of you who can't read or whatever, it says that, you know, basically Bannerman used to also give himself the buff as well if you hit allegiance. So it would become a 4/4 and buff everything else. And, you know, that was very strong for a time. And it still would be strong, I think. And obviously with Poppy, that might just push it over the edge a bit. So I'd probably be wary to do it now. However, if you did nerf Poppy, which they should have done, and, you know, it's really a shame that they didn't. And it seems that, you know, people are finally coming around to what I said when patch 2.18 was a disappointment. You know, people, I think, are coming around to that idea now. And yes. But with Poppy in a current state, you probably couldn't do this. But if you nerf Poppy, maybe you could. I do think it's possible. And I like my allegiance cards to be strong. That's just a personal preference of mine. I think that allegiance is a cool keyword. I think they could actually play around with allegiance a bit more, to be honest. But I want allegiance cards to be strong. So Bannerman, I would want to be strong as well. And another interesting case from this patch was Frenzied Skitterer that used to be a 3/3 and then became a 3/2, and as a 3/3 back in the day, it was an absolute powerhouse. And I think as a 3/3 today, it would be a good card. Not a crazy card, but a good card. Definitely that would see quite a bit of play. But I kind of want this back for the reason that I kind of want Fearsomes to be good again. That was Fearsomes was always one of those decks that I kind of liked. I didn't even play it that much myself, but I kind of liked its existence. You know, there's something about like elusive decks that are really cancerous to play against. But Fearsome, and to some extent Overwhelm as well, those decks always felt fairer. They always felt like, it was fine. It was a perfectly fine deck and no one would hate you for playing it, and I wouldn't hate anyone for playing it either. And I kind of want them back, and I think buffing Frenzied Skitterer again would be a good way of, one, helping Elise as well, and maybe helping Spiders as a whole, but also helping a Fearsome deck and giving Shadow Isles something back, because obviously Shadow Isles struggling a bit recently, but maybe the first time ever, so maybe it's time to, give them something back. Now we move all the way to patch 1.2, and one revert, I'm sure this is probably, universally agreed upon, is Loyal Badger Bear becoming a 4-4 again. I wouldn't change back Grizzled Ranger to a 4-1. I do think the Grizzled Ranger, it would be nice to have something there. And I think changing Badger Bear back to a 4-4 so that obviously Badger Bear is better than, like, Vanguard Sergeant. Like, why would you ever put this card in your deck at the moment? There really isn't a point. It basically is a useless card at this point because Vanguard Sergeant is just a clearly superior version to it. So I would expect that, of the reverts, this might be one that they would really consider. Making it a 4-4 again, and just making it so a vanilla card was actually, had higher stats than the other cards. Makes sense, right? So yeah, pretty obvious in this case. However, perhaps less obvious, but also more interesting, and maybe this is just my love of spiders coming out, and maybe both the Frenzied Skitterer change and this change would be too much, but Brood Awakening back to 5 mana would certainly be an interesting change, and for those of you who weren't aware, when Brood Awakening costs 5 mana, it becomes a very excellent tool at, dealing with aggro and dealing with wide boards in particular, because for one action you can get 3 units, and that can save you in a lot of cases. So, that's why Brood was particularly strong. And also, if you're in some sort of control mirror or whatever, Brood was a very good spell because you could, just sort of play it and push some damage if you wanted to as well. It's a very flexible card, but also again could help things like spiders. It's like a power card that can fit into a lot of different things, Brood Awakening, when it costs 5 mana. And so I think that because Shadow Isles is weak, this is the kind of change that, would really push forward a kind of Shadow Isles archetype. And for that reason, I think I like this change probably more than any other change, if I'm being honest. I would kind of really like to see Brood become 5 mana again. Moving on, we have War Chefs, and this is probably in the same category as Bannerman, where I do wish that this was a 2-3 again, because it would help other things like Lulu decks, and it would help Tarek decks, and there would be a lot of different things that you could do. Shen decks even would love War Chefs as well. There's tons of things that War Chefs helps enable. Obviously, the problem at the moment would be that it would also help enable Poppy, and that would probably be too much. So again, kind of fitting into that same theme as Bannerman, where I would love to see this change, but we probably need to tone down some of the Demacia things first in order to get this change to be real. So yeah, War Chefs, I would like to see it one day come back to a 2-3, and I think it would probably be fine existing as a 2-3 as well. But we probably do need to have a little word with Poppy over there and make sure that she isn't, completely dominating the game if we did make this change. Moving on to 1.14, and we find Riptide Rex, and Riptide Rex is an interesting one to, maybe change. I personally, right now, don't think I would change it. Obviously, Plunder is a very good deck right now, and that obviously would mean that something like Riptide Rex might just push them over the edge, which I think is very possible if you completely reverted it back to its old self. So I don't think I would do this right now. However, in the future, if there was, if Bilgewater was struggling, or if, Plunder was struggling for whatever reason, this I would consider this heavily bringing this back. Maybe you could keep the power at 6, but just, increase the cannon. I think that would overall be A change that I'm okay with, because again, it's kind of similar to Allegiance things. I like Allegiance cards being strong. I like big cards being strong as well. I like my 8 mana, 9 mana, 10 mana cards being, game winners. To be honest, that's what I want from these cards. And, so I want Riptide Rex to be a strong finisher card, to be honest. So yeah, Riptide Rex probably not right now, but maybe one day. If the right situation comes about, maybe one day. Moving on to patch 2.1, and we find Pale Cascade. And this is the one that I'm actually, I thought this would be an interesting discussion because I know some people have brought it up. And I even, in the past, brought up buffing this card back to its original form. However, that was with the intent of, that being the only change within Targon that I would have made at all. And that is not what we've seen, obviously. We've seen Targon, get some buffs in the most recent patch. And I would worry now, again, that, this would push Targon maybe a bit too far, because Pale, basically I was saying that Targon was pretty bad. Not as bad as people thought, but, it wasn't great. And if you just gave them back this one power card, and that be the only change you made, then that would enable, different things to come about in the right sphere. Now, I'm very glad that, they didn't do that a while ago, because otherwise Zoe Nami would have been even more crazy than it was. But now I'm against it again. Now that they've buffed other things in Targon, I'm out. I'm out on you, Pale Cascade, because this is a true power card. We don't see many cards like a combat trick losing a stat is a pretty big nerf. Ask Shapestone how big it is, just losing one attack. It's a monumental nerf for a combat trick. But Pale Cascade has survived that. Pale Cascade just lived. It still sees play in a ton of Targon decks, basically, because it's still just an insane card. And if you did revert this is the best card in the game again. Right? That is the difference it makes. This would literally go from a good option to the best card in the game. Like it was back in the day when it was a 2-1. So I'm actually against Pale Cascade right now, because Targon now I think is, doing okay as a whole. There are still some other things that I think you could do with Targon that would make it more interesting, but we should get a Targon champion, and also Bandle champion that is in Targon maybe as well. So we could get 2 Targon champions coming out pretty soon as well. So I don't think that, they also have to have the strongest card in the game as well. And moving on to patch 2.11. Yes, this is the final one that we'll look at, but there are 3 cards in here I do want to talk about. And the first one is Azir. Now, should Azir go back to 10 units to be leveled up? I don't know. I would still be a bit careful. But I do think, this could be brought down to 11. I would start with 11 and see what happened. Because Azir was always the one out of Azir Aurelia that could fit with more things and could enable more things, and was probably more liked by people. People liked Azir, particularly when he first came. When Azir first came out, before Aurelia came out, a lot of people were still playing Azir and they were having fun with him. And it was, everyone would have said Azir, great design, really well done. Then Aurelia came out, and obviously the combination of the two destroyed everything and left Azir's reputation in the ruins. Now that the Blade Dance has been significantly nerfed, maybe it would be okay to bring Azir back somewhat to there when people could start enjoying Azir maybe outside of Azir Aurelia again, and start looking at those kind of things and figuring out good Azir decks that can work, like with Lucian, or maybe Noxus, or whatever it might be. And maybe even, that does help a small resurgence for Blade Dance as well. Though obviously I don't want to see that become top tier again. But, just a mini resurgence, that would be okay as well. So, Azir, maybe a small buff I could see coming back. Moving on, we have Escaped Abomination. And this is one that I actually feel very passionately about, that this should be reverted to a 4-3. I think that Curse Keeper is a card that enables a lot of things within Shadow Isles, and I think by changing it, they kind of destroyed a lot of that. And so I think changing it back to a 4-3, look, a 4-4 was insane, but a 4-3 I think would still be fair, and I still think that it would be okay. I do think that we could exist in a world now with a 4-3 escaped abomination and not have to worry about it too much. I think that basically, I mean, the reason I'm doing this video is because Bandle City's power level has just increased, so the game's power level so much that a lot of these cards now that have been nerfed before, it's quite interesting that in patch 2.11, like, this is the patch that I'm picking the most out of, is because these cards could exist now. Like, all they had to do was wait a bit, and these cards would have been fine. But they didn't, and they changed them beforehand, and then Bandle City has come out, really quite pushed. And, it makes me a bit worried about, we're only going to see that probably continue even more. So I do think, giving these regions back some of their power cards, like Escape Abomination, would go quite a long way to helping Shadow Elves. And last but certainly not least, in fact, very not least, let's talk about Stalking Shadows, because obviously they said they aren't going to revert Stalking Shadows. This baffles me. Their whole reasoning that Shadow Isles isn't meant to have, this good kind of card draw engine things. Like, Shadow Isles still has, like, between Spirit Legion and Glimpse Beyond, it still has some of the best draw in the game. Which is just like, when they said that, I was just like, what? Why print this card? Like, I was thinking, like, why would you print this card if like, Shadow Isles isn't meant to have good, like, draw tools? It was just baffling. It truly was baffling. So, they aren't going to revert Stalking Shadows. They've pretty much said as much, not going to revert it. Which is kind of making me a bit sad. And the reason for that is, Shadow Isles felt like the most fleshed out region for a long time. In fact, for pretty much the entire length of the game, it felt like all the other regions were missing something. And Shadow Isles was actually the correct amount. Not initially. Initially, Shadow Isles was just insane. But after a couple nerfs in the early days, they found Shadow Isles in a place that was a good place overall, I thought. And it kind of existed in that sense for a long time, where Shadow Isles was probably the most popular region in terms of, feeling good to play with and not feeling too bad to play against. And it felt like a fully fleshed out region pretty much from the start. And I think the reason that was because they had the right amount of power cards. Shadow Isles had more power cards than the other regions. It had Glimpse Beyond, it had Stalking Shadows, it had Curse Keeper, it had Vile Feast. And all of those cards could be used in combination with a lot of the themes of the region, and they were all very powerful in their own right as well, and they synergized very well with a lot of things. And so it worked. So that's what made it feel like a fully fleshed out region, is that they had 4 power cards that worked, one, with the themes of the region very well, but also, worked with other things as well, worked with other regions quite well in different ways. And Stalking Shadows was a big part of that. And now that they've lost both Curse Keeper and Stalking Shadows from that mix, Shadow Isles now feels like a region that isn't fully fleshed out. It feels like a region that has taken a step back, which is kind of weird. And I don't like it. I would prefer them to rip up whatever they think about Shadow Isles' draw potential and make Stalking Shadows 2-mana again, because it enabled so much. It enabled a ton of different decks on its own. That's a good thing, because when you take that away, you have taken away a lot of different decks that needed it. All those Nightfall decks. Basically, a lot of the mid-range in Shadow Isles, a lot of the aggro in Shadow Isles, it's just gone. You could probably list about, 5 or 6 different decks that kind of wanted or needed Stalking Shadows. It had so many synergies, with the ephemeral synergies. Things like Chirian Sunworker needed Stalking Shadows. Naxxus Thresh, those kind of decks needed Stalking Shadows. They Who Endure decks, similar thing. They need Stalking Shadows. As I was talking about, Nightfall, just like a kind of burn aggro Shadow Isles deck. They all needed Stalking Shadows to be good to enable them to see play. And so by taking it away, I feel like you've just kind of swept the foot under Shadow Isles. And instead of nerfing these cards, I think what they should have done is look to buff other cards, find the right cards, buff those cards within the other regions, so that each region had about, 4 power cards to use like Shadow Isles did. I think that that is honestly what we needed, and it's a shame that they nerfed it. So they're not going to revert Stalking Shadows, it sounds like, but I kind of wish that they would. And so that is all of it. That is the whole thing. That's the whole shebang. All of the cards that I think, or some interesting, choices for potential reverts in particular. I'd love to know what you think as well. Tell me, am I wrong about some of these? Would something break the game? I just picked out some interesting cases that I thought I could talk about. And so with that said, thank you so much for watching and have a really nice day.